In our video number 1, we learnt about economic problems. Economic problems that arise due to the unlimited wants of humans. All wants cannot be satisfied because of limited resources. And these resources, there is a possibility of alternative uses. That means these resources can be put to many other uses. And that's what we call alternative uses of resources. Now in our video number 2, we are going to learn how to allocate these limited resources in order to produce goods and services for consumption. So let's learn how to allocate resources, otherwise called allocation of resources or central problems of an economy. Any economy has problems. These problems are called as central problems of any economy. What are these problems? These problems are, given some resources, what am I going to do? So what do I produce? Or simply, what to produce with a given resource. Okay, now I decide what to produce. Now how do I produce a good? What technique should I use to produce goods? Okay, after I decide what technique I am going to use, now I have to decide for whom should I produce? For which section of the society should I produce these goods? Let's look into these 3 problems and try to understand how each economy tries to solve these central problems. Let's look at the first problem. What to produce? Now we saw resources are there which are scarce, and resources can be put to alternative uses. Now the question is, what should I produce with a given resource? Should I produce consumption goods? Consumption goods are general, basic goods for basic needs like food, clothes, etc. Should I produce goods for investment, otherwise called capital goods? What are these capital goods? These capital goods are those goods which are used to produce further. That means for further production. For example, plant, machinery, tools, equipment, etc. Then, should I produce goods for social welfare or should I produce goods for defense? So, what should I produce? Okay, after I decide what should I produce, now what quantity should I produce? That means how much should I produce? If I produce more of consumption goods, then I'll have to produce less of capital goods. If I produce more of capital goods, then I have to produce less of consumption goods and other goods. Why? Because resources are scarce, limited resources. So the quantity is also a question. Okay. Now with fixed resources, we can have a combination of different goods and services so that you can produce consumption goods, capital goods, social welfare goods, defense, whatever we want. Then we'll have to divide these resources in such a way that a portion or a proportion, let us say a percentage of every good can be produced. Now, in market economy, that means those countries which we call capitalist countries, in these countries or in such economies, the producer decides what to produce because the main intention is to maximize profit. And this profit maximization depends on the supply and demand. That means demand for goods and supply of goods. This decides what to produce. There is another economy called centrally planned economy. A centrally planned economy is taken care of by the government. Here we can see centrally planned. So the central authority or the government decides what type of goods to produce or what to produce. Now, since government is taking care of it, it would look into maximizing social welfare, right? So here, social welfare is maximized. It wouldn't look into profit maximization because it is looking into equality, bringing in equality in the society. Then there is a third type of an economy called mixed economy, which India has adopted. In such economies, there is importance to both public sector and the private sector. Public sector, that is governed by the government, and private sector by the private partners. Now here the public sector would look into social welfare and the private sector would look into profit maximization. So a mixed economy looks into or takes care of both social welfare as well as profit maximization. Now let us look at the second question. How to produce? That means the technique of production. What technique should I use? Should we go for labor intensive technique, where there is more availability of labor or manpower that uses less capital? The investment on labor would be lesser when compared to capital intensive technique. So whether to use labor intensive technique or whether to use capital intensive technique. In capital intensive technique, there is more use of capital. That means machines, tools, etc. would be used more and there would be less labor. Alright. Now, labor intensive technique promotes employment. Why? Because more labor is used. So, it promotes employment. That means what? It takes care of the welfare and the unemployment issues. It reduces unemployment. However, there is a problem. When more labor is used, that means less of the machines will be used. So here a low quality product would be produced, which will be sold at higher cost. Low investment would mean lower GDP also. Then let us look at capital intensive technique. Since machines are used over here and less of labor is used, this promotes efficiency and more quantity would be produced. More units of the goods and services would be produced. This improves the quality also because machines are used. And since the investment over here is more, it would accelerate GDP. So growth is more when you look at capital intensive technique when compared to the labor intensive technique. Now, how would the three economies look at this? If it is a market economy or a capitalist economy, it would look into profit maximization and hence it would use capital intensive technique. Now, if it is a centrally planned economy, that means where the government takes the hold, there social welfare is more or maximizing social welfare. So that would look into labor intensive technique. Now, in mixed economies, since the mixed economy looks into profit maximization as well as social welfare, both labor intensive technique and capital intensive technique would be utilized depending upon the situation or requirement. Now the last question is, for whom to produce? Now any economy has got two sections of society. One, the richer, and the other, the poorer section. By rich we mean a higher income group, and by poor we mean only a low income group. Now what happens with this section of the society, the higher income group? They will have a greater purchasing power. That means they can buy goods at a higher price also. They can afford to buy. and they will buy luxurious goods, and here there will be more profits for producers. So producers can make more profit if they produce goods for a higher income group. Now if you look at the lower income group, one must look at social justice because they cannot afford to buy or they have low purchasing power. If goods are produced for the low income group, it would reduce inequality. Then here, of course, because goods would be produced for a low section or lower income group, the profits will also be low. This would imply that there is lower investment. A lower investment implies lower GDP. That means there will be slow growth rate. However, if these kind of goods are produced, then that means when profit maximization is taken care of, then the growth will be faster. So, the capitalist economy would produce goods which would maximize profits, and so those goods will be for the higher income groups. Now, in centrally planned economy, since it looks into maximizing social welfare, the goods will be produced more in quantity for lower income groups. Now, a mixed economy looks into both profit maximization as well as social welfare. So, goods would be produced for both the richer section or the higher income groups as well as the lower income groups. Now, for some time we had these underdeveloped countries. Now, we do not have any underdeveloped countries. We have all countries are called as developing countries. There is scope for improvement now. So, all countries are called as developing countries. Now, in developing countries, there is one more issue, that is underutilization or inefficiency in utilizing the resources. This could be due to various reasons. One could be that we do not have enough expertise, we do not have enough capital, or it could be because of the lack of work culture, where there are often lockouts and buns, such kind of things, where the output gets affected. So there also you have inefficient utilization of resources. So those were the three problems, and the methods in which the different economies would solve these problems.